everyone. Welcome back to the American Experiment Podcast. My name is Grace Keating. I'm here with Kathryn Hinderacker.
Hello.
It's episode 46.
And it's election day.
Election day. How are you feeling?
I'm stressed. There's already been some reports of like voter machines not working, things like that. And in Minnesota, yeah. I don't know. I mean, no one seems to be that concerned. I think it's like, you know, they just got to put them through later. I don't know. I'm stressed.
Have you voted yet?
No, I'm going later today. I feel like a lot of people early voted this year. Is that what you did?
No, but I know probably 5 people who did, which is more than any other year.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
I like to go on the day of, you know? It's kind of like a thing. Make a day out of it.
Yep.
It's fun to do. So
more fun.
I'm an in-person voter, but I do get stressed. Like, well, I don't know. What if something goes wrong? I just got to stop thinking about it.
It's going to be great. Go vote if you haven't already. We have a great, I think, episode lined up for today. We're going to do all election-themed content, and then later we're going to bring on Bill Walsh to interview Rob Autry, who is one of the leading pollsters in the country. He's done our Thinking Minnesota magazine polls for years now, and they're going to do kind of a behind-the-scenes deep dive on the ins and outs of polling. It's going to be really interesting, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, we'll jump right in.
Let's get into it.
We have some big announcement. Golden Turkey voting is open.
Very exciting.
Yes, very exciting. Every year we award, the Golden Turkey Award to the silliest example of Minnesota's wasteful
Most
spending.
bird-brained. I think our communications department always throws in there.
Yeah, we have some truly terrible nominees this year. Let's see, we have the $18 million National Loon Center.
National Loon Center. Is that like the bird or the people? Or the...
That would be the bird.
Okay.
Like the state bird. Because we have a National Eagle Center, I guess, in Minnesota. Oh. And so they were like, let's spend $18 million on a loon center.
18 million?
Isn't that a lot?
And what do they do? Research loons?
Yeah. It hasn't been built yet. I think that's the idea. That's nominee number 1. Then we have 173 Wallace Administration DEI employees. I'm just going to rapid fire these. We'll get into these more in depth in the weeks to come. But for right now, we'll just list them off. Then we have the new state flag and seal, which I think is maybe going to be the winner. It's a pretty hated topic at the moment. Yeah. And then we had $10,000 spent to produce a Dungeons and Dragons podcast.
I love these. I love the like little ones. They're my favorite.
I do too. I really do too.
Dungeons and Dragons, wasn't that, not to like, throw shade, but wasn't that cool like a long time ago? Aren't we a little behind the Dungeons and Dragons phase?
I think people still play it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is that where you're like a chaotic something?
I think that's where that comes from. Yeah, like the chaotic neutral.
Good,
you have all these
or whatever.
classes of
good,
neutral, evil, and like chaotic.
What's the
rule following? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. But that
is where that comes from, though. I think. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting.
Anyway,
well, maybe we'll investigate and we'll talk about it next week. Maybe.
Yeah. If you don't want to wait to learn about them, go to www.goldenturkeymn.com. You can read about them there and cast your vote. Winner announced on November 27th. Moving on.
Should we also apply this podcast? Can we get money? This one got $10,000. And I looked back in previous years. This podcast has gotten money multiple years. I think the total is like over $30,000 that they've gotten for their Dungeons and Dragons podcast. Do you know what we could do with this podcast with that kind of dough? Just a thought.
We could play Dungeons and Dragons on this podcast.
We could play Dungeons and Dragons.
$1,000. Anyway, it's election day. I don't even know how to introduce this topic. It's so funny. A local socialist group in Minnesota has decided that they're going to protest the election results on Wednesday, so tomorrow, regardless of the outcome. They don't give a time or a place of this protest. They're just kind of putting it out there.
We will be protesting no matter what. I saw a graphic and it literally says that. Like, no matter what the outcome, we are protesting.
They stand by their beliefs, I suppose.
Just ready to go at all times, at all hours. We will protest whatever's happening. It's so funny. I mean, it sounds like a parody. Like, what? They're just sat and ready to protest no matter what happens.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll see what happens.
Moving on.
Maybe I'll be out there with them, but it depends on the result.
A more substantial story from Bill Glahn. They're putting up all these pop-up voting locations in the Twin Cities. Mostly Minneapolis is doing this. This is a new thing that they just legalized, I think, in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
The first one was at the University of Minnesota campus in the Twin Cities, and it did really, really well, apparently. And then they did another one in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, and no one came, is my understanding.
Yeah, well, Okay, my favorite part from the article, Bill Glahn wrote this. He was like, think Spirit Halloween store, but in voting. It's like, that's
and
so...
it like changes locations every day.
It's so true. Yeah,
so
every day
funny.
it's somewhere else. It's so interesting. I mean, I live in Hennepin County. I never heard about this except for after the fact. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know how they were telling people. I mean, I suppose I just wasn't targeted where I am, maybe. I don't know how they're telling people, but I think it's an interesting idea. I don't like necessarily hate it. I feel like could be useful to bring it really close to people, like in a campus situation, you know? The only problem I have with that is I think there's already so many laws, like we've talked about before, where it makes it easier. It makes it really, really, really easy for people to vote. Like if you have a school ID, you can just like pop in there. Even if you're an international student, say you're here on a visa, you're not a citizen, you just have to show your school ID. As far as I know, there are not really laws that help verify, is this person even a citizen? So to me, that's one of the areas of, potential fraud that has always kind of worried me. So is it the same deal with these pop-up things? I mean, I think that they kind of introduce these things in the legislature and then they don't investigate them or study them first. So it's like we're kind of experimenting with voting, which is like the worst thing in the world to experiment with, I feel. But at the same time, it's interesting. Bring a location really close to people.
Yeah. Yeah, the locations were interesting. They had a homeless shelter, the university campus, an art museum, theaters, rec centers, and a church. It's a nice idea. We'll see how the execution goes.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't know. They also Bill Glahn pointed out that the locations were strategically placed in like low turnout areas of the city. But that the flip side is that like 80% of the votes cast in these areas were mail-in ballots.
Yeah, like already mailed in.
Yeah,
or
so
they typically mail. It's
that
not
kind of explains why the turnout was so low at some of them.
Because they're already voting by mail.
Yeah.
That's what so many people are doing now. It's just like you don't really have the excuse anymore of like, oh, well, you never have. It's like the voting place is so close to you wherever you are. But you also can just mail it in. It's so easy. So this seems very unnecessary upon discussing it for 2 minutes.
Yeah. Which presumably the legislators that put this in did not.
There's just like this weird like thing. There are people who think that it's like so hard to vote. You know what I mean? Like these campaigns, we've talked about this in the past, but these campaigns are like, just get out and vote, everyone. You got to go vote. And they give you all the information. It's really not that hard. If people aren't voting, it's probably because they don't feel like they have the information to vote.
True.
It's probably not the resources.
No, that's so true. There's so many people who just don't care, or like maybe they kind of know there's an election going on, but they're like, maybe I'm not an informed enough voter to make a good decision.
And by the way,
here.
that is okay. It's your choice to vote. If you feel like I don't have enough information, I don't know who to trust right now, you don't have to vote. It's okay. And if you're voting, you should be, and I think have a responsibility to be very informed about what you're voting on.
Yeah.
And, pull up your sample ballot. Make sure you know ahead of time every single bubble you're filling in, because sometimes there'll be like, oh, I don't know, a really vague question about a constitutional amendment that is like, do you want clean water? Vote yes. And you don't actually know what it's about because you didn't look it up beforehand. Yep. So I think it's not just a responsibility to vote, it's a responsibility to know what the heck's going on and then vote. And if you don't feel like you do, it's okay to sit out a vote if you really do not feel informed. But you should get informed and you should vote.
Yeah.
And if you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously super well informed.
True.
So you should go vote.
Yes. Speaking of being informed, let's talk about the lottery amendment that's on the ballot this year.
This is the clean water one, right?
This is the clean water one, yeah. Do we have anyone in the area who maybe knows a little bit more about this than we do?
Yeah, maybe. Should we ask Bill Walsh?
Bill, are you over there? Can you come on, please?
Bill.
Welcome, Bill.
Come
on over. Thanks for joining us.
Slide on up.
Our elections expert,
Great
Bill
to be
Walsh.
Here. I was walking by.
Welcome to the pod.
Don't sing me the Bill Nye Science Guy, the song, though. That guy's a fraud.
Bill. We used to sing in school.
We could do a whole show on that
Bill
guy.
Nye is not a guy. That you can't sing
gosh.
in school anymore.
So mean.
I think he's a guy, but he's not a science guy. He's a TV guy who plays a science guy on TV, and then he wants to run around the world telling us all about global warming because he thinks he's some kind of expert, and he's not.
I don't
That's a different
disagree.
show. That's
It's just a fun
different show.
song.
Okay. What do you want to talk about?
Bill, can you tell us about the lottery amendment? Because I know I'm supposed to vote no on it,
Vote
and
no.
I don't know why.
And if you read what's on the ballot, it's like,
oh, yeah,
Why don't
no,
you
let's
read it?
read the question.
Read the question. Yeah, it's sad.
Shall the Minnesota Constitution be amended to protect drinking water sources and the water quality of lakes, rivers, and streams, conserve wildlife habitat and natural areas, improve air quality, and expand access to parks and trails by extending the transfer of proceeds from the state-operated lottery to the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and to dedicate the proceeds for these purposes?
Sounds great.
How could you argue with that?
Who would vote against that, right? I mean, this is sort of like, the amendment question gets to be written by those in power. So the Democrats are in control of the legislature. You have a trifecta government. They get to extend this. It's already something we've been doing for years, and we're going to extend it for another 25. But they get to write the question.
Wait, 25 years?
Yeah, this is a 25-year decision. So we'll revisit this again. The voters will revisit again in the future. But
I'll be over 50.
This is our chance to say no. There's a lot of reasons to vote no. We wrote a piece like the 8 reasons to vote no. You can start with big reasons like constitutionally dedicated funding is stupid. It's just not a good way to run government. So we could have a deficit in a couple years. Maybe say next year, next budget is a deficit, and there's not enough money. The legislature is going to fight over, should we put money into schools? Should we cut human services? Should we throw grandma out of the nursing home? All these horrible things that we're going to have to do. But this money is constitutionally dedicated from the lottery. It comes in, it fills up the bank account, and it gets spent on these projects, no matter what. You can't take that money and help the other parts of the budget that may need it. So what you're doing by constitutionally dedicating funds is you're taking the legislature out of the equation. So the people we elect to make these tough decisions on the state budget, we're taking money out of their hands. They're not going to be able to do it. So they'll set up these there's commissions and committees that do this.
So basically the people in power want to do it this way so that their power extends beyond the time that they might be in office, but for 25 years.
Well, right. Or the people that have this as an interest. I mean, the interest groups that are behind this and other constitutional amendments, they get theirs no matter what happens in the legislature. So it's like, awesome. Our stuff is funded no matter what.
It's like helping your friends.
Yeah,
You're protecting money for your friends.
It's a bad way to run government, to take things off the legislature's plate that they should be deciding every 2 years because they're in touch with the people and what's going on. Secondly, it's gambling is the source of the revenue. So, I mean, I think it's morally bad to have the state government to get money from gambling. And they even know it's bad because every year they do these things. In the revenue that comes in, we set aside some money for problem gambling, for hotlines to call, for the negative social effects that we know is going to happen because we're promoting this gambling to get revenue to do these clean water projects. It's just another globally not a good way to run your government. I mean, if you think this is a good idea, fund it. Clean water is a great thing, and Minnesotans support that. The legislature should delegate and allocate money for that every year in the state budget. And we do, by the way, lots more than this amendment. So those are big global reasons. I mean, the other thing is that they've screwed this up a couple of ways. We've been doing it for a long time, the original amendment. Now we're going to renew it, but we're not going to renew what's been in there. We're going to do a little bit more. So we're going to create a fund now to fund, I would call them, DEI projects. We're going to fund projects in underserved areas, which means color of your skin, basically, or groups of people. So there's going to be a whole nother set of money set aside within this fund to go to those kind of projects.
And that's new. That's new this year.
This is all new. It's a new. They're going to take another 1.5% out of the principal. By the way, this money has been growing from the lottery proceeds for years. There's billions of dollars in this fund. We're using the interest every year. The corpus, as they call it, remains very strong. You could not do this if we vote no. If that happens today in the election and the no vote comes up, these projects will get funded for a long time. There's a lot of money to live off of and just spend down if we wanted to. But now they're going to take another 1.5% of the funding every year and give it to a committee that is appointed by the governor, that is heavily stacked. First of all, in favor of Native American tribes, they have like half the committee, and then the rest of it's BIPOC people, and that could be it. They could stop right there and not put anybody else on the committee. They're going to make these decisions. This money is going to not go through the legislature. The old money and the most of the money from the fund still has to get a vote in the legislature. So a committee decides what the projects are, and they fund it, but the legislature still has to bless their work. This new thing, no blessing from the legislature, straight to the I mean, the DNR has some say in it, but it's really, really weak accountability. So that's another reason to vote. The other thing they're doing that's kind of nefarious, I think, there's been a big fight at the legislature over kind of the definition of clean water. What does that mean? And there's different kinds of water projects that go on at the legislature. And we've done a lot of wastewater treatment plants that cities need help with to clean their water on the front end. And there's been this fight. You can't use this constitutionally dedicated money for that. We want this to go to like wetlands and things like that, and not to wastewater treatment, which a lot of people at the Capitol say, well, that's clean water. That's the essence of clean water. We can use some of this lottery money to take care of these needs that cities and counties have around the state to do it. And so that's been a big legislative fight. That fight is over if this passes today, because they've written into the constitutional language these money cannot go to the wastewater treatment projects that many in the legislature have fought over. So they're ending that argument in their favor. So again, we'll have to use other tax dollars to do those worthwhile projects for cities and counties around the state in wastewater cleanup. And this money will be saved for the, buying wetlands and, who knows what. So that's another kind of reason to do it. I can't remember what the other 8 are. We've probably done 4 of the 8.
That's all I needed personally.
Yeah.
Wow. Holy cow.
It's just, there's a lot of reasons to vote no. And there will be still a big pile of money there if we vote no. We've got to stop doing constitutionally dedicated funding. It's bad. We elect people to make these decisions. Let's keep doing that.
What other examples of, like constitutionally protected funding are there? Because I like the very concept of this is insane to me.
Yeah.
That there's money protected in our Constitution that can't be touched. Like, isn't this something the legislature should be doing when they pass a budget bill?
We really have the 2 big ones in Minnesota. This one, the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, that gets funded through the lottery, and then the Legacy Fund, which gets funded through the Constitution, again, but by a sales tax. A portion of the state sales tax goes to the Legacy Fund. And by the way, both funds, the Legacy Fund and the Environment and Natural Resource Trust Fund, have been a constant and good source of golden turkey nominees. And so that's a sign that these funds are not being used right, because every year, including 2 this year, the Loon Center was funded with Environmental and Natural Resources Trust Fund money originally.
Oh my gosh.
The original $4 million grant to get it going.
Because the money's just sitting there, right? So like it's not like you can just pick, it should go to the thing with the biggest need, the most need. It has to go to these like predetermined kind of segments, right? Areas.
Yep. And it has to get spent every year. Because it comes in and it goes out. There's no,
Might as well do a Loon Center, even though St. Paul, have you seen that city? It sucks. The roads are terrible.
Hey, let's not do a St. Paul thing now. I like St. Paul, but that's another podcast.
Soft spot.
But yeah, we are, it's a constant source, these funds are, of silly spending, stupid spending. You were talking earlier about the Dungeons and Dragons podcast. That is legacy money that comes from the sales tax, constitutionally dedicated. So no legislator voted to do that necessarily.
Like, my sales tax should be going to roads, and police and fire. Why am I funding someone's D&D podcast? Oh my gosh!
Because you live in Minnesota.
That's terrible. Let's fix that.
Agree.
Wow. All right, vote no. That's all I needed to hear.
Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thank you.
That was very informative.
Bill, do you want to stay for our final segment?
No.
No. Oh.
Oh, okay. Bye.
Too well informed. Don't care about the Twitterverse. Okay.
Well. Because I am very excited about our final segment. I'm gonna move this.
I'm excited now too.
So something that was big on the internet this week, Grace.
Okay.
Is Peanut the squirrel. Did you hear about Peanut?
I heard about Peanut. Yes.
Okay, it's actually a really tragic tale. So if you are listening, you got kids around, anything like that, plug in some AirPods maybe, because it's a really sad story. I'm going to read from the New York Post here. The title is Peanut the Squirrel, Beloved Pet and Internet Sensation Euthanized After Being Seized by New York State. So Peanut the Squirrel of internet fame has been euthanized after the pet was seized by New York State earlier this week, according to the Department of Environmental Conservation. The 7-year-old gray rescue squirrel, commonly referred to as Peanut on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, was put to death along with Fred the raccoon so that the animals could be tested for rabies. Basically, then Peanut's father, it says here guardian, I would say father, Mark Longo, took to Instagram to memorialize his beloved pet in a video. Through tears with his girlfriend at his side, he said, Peanut was the best thing that has ever happened to us.
Oh my gosh, I know this story and I'm like tearing up as you're reading this.
It's really so sad. Peanut was really cute and adorable and friendly by all accounts. He was keeping him, and also they don't live in like New York City. They keep saying New York. They live in upstate New York on like they call it Peanuts Freedom Farm. Because it's like they're like raising money for rescuing animals.
That's so cute.
So they're not, just like in an apartment.
They're not like
in
downtown
New York City,
Manhattan.
right?
Okay.
Like holding the squirrel in there or whatever, and a raccoon. Let's not forget about Fred. They were, on this like rescue farm, and it's a really sad story. Like apparently they had nothing better to do in New York but bust into this couple's house and steal away their squirrel and their raccoon and kill them and test them for rabies.
I heard about this because Trump came out with like a statement against it. I think that's what first brought it to my
Honestly,
attention.
that statement might have been fake. Do you think it was? Yeah,
Really?
It might have been fake.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
There was a lot of like internet discourse around it, of course, because just the idea that the government has this kind of time on their hands, I think is what really is the heart of the matter.
Sure.
That in New York they're housing illegals, they're giving them tons of money, and they're giving them jobs and healthcare and free school. There's so many issues in New York, and they have chosen to go into this couple's farmhouse and steal away their pet squirrel and pet raccoon.
It's a bad look. It's a really bad look.
So
and I think people
know,
are very angry.
JD Vance did reference it at a rally. So, I do think that the Trump campaign was more Team Peanut. But yeah, that statement may have been fake.
I always hear that like the quickest way to get, if you're making a movie or a show or something, the quickest way to get people to hate the villain is to show the villain killing an animal. Just humans empathize with that in just a completely different way than if you were hurting another human being. And this totally made me think of that. I think so many people heard this story about this sweet little squirrel and sweet little raccoon. And if it's at all tied to one party, I think you're going to get a lot of very angry voters out there today. Up in arms for Peanut.
Could this swing some swing states?
I don't know.
We'll have to
I think so, maybe.
We'll have to see. I know you also hear that that's like one of the number one qualities of, is it psychopaths?
Yes, hurting
Is, like,
animals.
hurting
It's like an
animals?
early sign that serial killers have, is tormenting animals. Yeah.
Is everyone in the government a psychopath? Maybe. So yeah, Peanut the squirrel and also Fred the raccoon, don't want to, leave him behind.
Right.
They both were put to death. R.I.P. You can check them out on Instagram. They got some cute videos, really cute videos. And the parents, have been, posting about it, trying to raise money for Peanut's Freedom Farm. It's a sad story.
Oh my gosh, is there anything less sad that I missed this week online?
Well, yes, actually. There is.
Okay.
Moodang.
Yeah? Oh my gosh, the hippo.
Moodang
the
reappeared.
baby hippo.
Yeah, the baby hippo. Moodang thinks Trump is going to win.
Okay.
Predicted a Trump victory.
How?
Apparently. I mean, like, honestly, I watched the video and I didn't quite get it. But there was like 2 cakes. And then they put them in front of Moodang.
Okay.
And he picked the Trump cake. Now, the words on the cake were not in English. They were in a different language.
Oh.
I don't remember where he is. It's in Chinese.
I don't
or
remember. Yeah, somewhere in
Korean
Asia.
something. He picked the one that says Trump. Apparently, I couldn't read the cake, but apparently it did. So Moodang predicted a Trump victory, and it was very exciting. For the internet.
Exciting. Thanks, Moodang.
And also found
Thanks for
one of my
weighing in.
favorite categories of like mindless scrolling videos, which is animals predicting things. Like there's like a corgi who predicts every single sports game in the world. He like bops a little ball. Someone off camera throws him a ball. He's standing on the stairs, and this corgi like boops it, and there's 2 buckets for each sports team, and he predicts victories.
But what is his success rate? Like, is that why people are watching?
I don't think so. I think it's like, you're in bed trying to fall asleep and you're like, oh my God, this corgi is so cute.
What a unique form of content that I don't ever get recommended to me.
Yeah, and must take up these people's entire lives. See, this guy does every sports game. Like, do you know how many there are? So many.
That's hilarious.
And they get millions of views.
Oh my gosh, that's a little upsetting. Okay.
It's a little upsetting, but it's really cute. So hopefully the corgi's not next, guys. Vote! Like, the animals' lives depend on it.
Yes, please.
That's our election day message to you.
Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for Bill's conversation with Rob, coming right up. American Experiment is supported by thousands of individuals like you. To join the movement, go to www.americanexperiment.org and click the yellow donate button. From all of us here, thank you.
All right, welcome back to the American Experiment Podcast. We're going to be talking today with our pollster, Rob Autry from Meeting Street Insights, and get a little bit of insight into how polling works. So as many of you know, we have a quarterly magazine called Thinking Minnesota, and part of that magazine every quarter is we do a poll. And Rob is our pollster, has been our pollster kind of from the beginning, I think. You were the original pollster for the magazine. We're going on 6 years of polling, pretty much 4 polls a year for 6 years. And I thought it'd be good for the podcast, just because we've got this expert, and we're coming into the election, or today's actually election day. So I thought you'd be a great podcast guest, so we can just kind of talk the anatomy of polling, how it works, what you go through, what we go through, and we put together our poll, which I'm sure is a similar process for others. But that's going to be the second part of the podcast today. Thanks for joining us, Rob. And you're at an undisclosed location on the East Coast, or toward South Carolina, right?
Right. We're based in Charleston, South Carolina.
Awesome. What a great place to live and work. It's cold here. I'll just say that. We're heading into winter. So, Rob, start just with your background. There's people like, how do you end up being a pollster? What's your educational background? I mean, is there a statistics degree, or what does it take to kind of be a pollster professionally?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be with you today, and obviously have really loved our relationship over the last 6 years with the center and all the polling that we've done. It's fascinating work, and it always amazes me kind of where folks or all the kind of things that we learn kind of doing a survey that we didn't expect to learn kind of going into it. And so my background, I was kind of a political junkie in college. I kind of got the political bug. I was a politics major, worked on campaigns kind of at the local level in North Carolina when I went to college at Wake Forest. And I entered my senior year with a politics major and a bunch of economic credits. And I kind of realized that I enjoyed economics just as much as I did politics. And so I graduated with a double major in both. But coming out of college, being a politics economics major, it usually means you go to grad school, law school, or you go work for an accounting firm or something like that. I didn't want to do any of those things. I really wanted to get into politics, and went to the career services office, said, hey, here's my academic background. Here's what I want to do. And she politely told me, well, you got to go to DC and pass out your resume, which I did. Went around the hill, passed out my resume for a couple of weeks, had a couple of interviews, and through that process realized I didn't really want to work on Capitol Hill. I really wanted to work in campaigns. I got connected to a general consultant who put me on a state house race in Northern Virginia, then a state Senate race in Northern Virginia. Then I was hired as a campaign manager for a congressional race in Mississippi. All of this within like a 3 or 4 year process coming out of college. And it was that last congressional race that I managed in Mississippi where I began to doubt whether or not I really wanted to be involved in campaigns at that level. And one of the things that I was most fascinated about the campaign world was polling. We would get the polling data back. I would pour through the crosstabs. And I sort of realized that was kind of something I was interested in. I met with the pollster that we had hired for that campaign after the election. We went to lunch. I came back with a job offer, and I went to work for him and was with that polling firm for 18 and a half years. Started as a very basic entry-level job, and by the time I left, I was one of the managing partners. So I learned polling really from starting at the ground level at a polling firm. Did that until 2014, and then started my own shop in 2015.
Yeah, and so was that you were at Public Opinion Strategies, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so I mean, over the years, my career working on campaigns, both some statewide, congressional, and mostly caucus work, House caucus or Senate caucus, legislative races. I mean, we've hired them before. I've hired Public Opinion Strategies, and I know a lot of your colleagues, your former colleagues. Great firm. So it's kind of fascinating because, and just from my perspective as a political hack on the other side, you get in these meetings as you go through a campaign. You have a campaign manager on the ground for like a congressional campaign. You hire, usually if you're raising money, a general consultant, and that could be from the state, and a lot of times it's not. It's somebody you bring in. You always got to bring in somebody because they know more than we do here, certainly. And then so that's a key person. And then you've got the pollster. And so you're doing polling, but talk to us about the role, because I found it on the political side, you're really one of the key advisors because you're interpreting the poll data, and you do several polls. Maybe lay out what you would do in a congressional campaign, how many polls you do, or how often you'd be in the field. But there's these meetings, these strategy meetings, where I never wanted a strategy meeting when I was running a campaign that didn't have the pollster in the room to keep us on track, right?
Right. And a lot of times the strategy meeting is built around having polling data. So yeah, let me kind of start big picture for a second. I think it's important for the listeners to kind of just keep in mind, because I think when we hear pollster or polling, we immediately think of ballot test and whether or not it's going to predict who's going to win or not. And in the campaign world, survey research is treated as a tool, not a predictor, right? Most campaigns pretty much stop polling about 2 or 3 weeks out, because at that point, the strategy's been developed, it's been honed, reshaped, refined, and we just use the last few weeks of the campaign to execute on that strategy. So as a tool, my experience has been that winning campaigns generally have 4 key elements. One, they have candidate quality. 2, having a focused and persuasive message. 3, importantly, they have the money to be able to share that candidate quality and that focus and persuasive message with voters. And then number 4, they have an effective grassroots operation. Polling is designed to help you with number 1, the candidate quality piece, and that having focus and persuasive message. So we use polling to better understand how we introduce the candidate to voters. What are the key brand attributes that we want to share with voters, that we want to build his or her reputation, their image numbers around? And then what are the focus and persuasive messages we can use to get the voters we need? And it's very simple level. Any poll in a campaign has 2 objectives. One is define your target audience. Who is it that you need to win to get to that 50% plus one? And number 2 is, how do you develop the communications and messaging strategy to get to 50% plus one? How do you convince those voters to follow you and your candidate and vote for him? And so that is what we primarily use polling for in campaigns.
So what does that look like when you start? I mean, you're going to like a baseline poll just to kind of get the baseline and just to test initial things. That can happen pretty much any time, right? Or in May or April, or when you get your first one?
It really depends on kind of the campaign timeline. So one of the things is, we sit down initially, we look at our plan budget, our campaign plan, and when we're going to start spending money. And then we look well past that date or before that date to when we want to do the polling. So in a typical race, after the primary is settled, once we've gotten all of our research into our voting record or our professional background, that of our opponent, all of that information is shared with the team and particularly with the pollster. That's when we'll typically start drafting what we call the benchmark survey. And that's the big survey where we really test all the messages for our candidate in terms of how we position and introduce them to voters. Also, we test some vulnerabilities on our candidate so that we know when our opponent hits us, how that's going to resonate or not resonate with voters. And then we do the same for our opponent to understand sort of their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. We test issues. We test what issues are most important to voters. Not only that, but what nuances of those messages are those issues are we able to convert into messaging for our opponent. So we do all of that in the benchmark, and then obviously kind of the targeting audience, who our target voters are going to be, what our vote goal with those voters are going to be. How do we develop that, what we call the winning coalition, to get to that 50% plus one? All of that typically is done, I would say, at least a month, if not 2 months before the campaign really starts to spend money. So that kind of differs based on when the primary date is, but for most campaigns, it's usually in the summer. That's when, as pollsters, we're busier because we're drafting those much larger surveys and then having to dissect that data in much more detail.
I want to touch on something you said. You said you test messages, including negative messages on your own candidate, and you're going to test some messages on your opponent. A lot of times that happens in a campaign, and then you see people on Twitter and saying, they're push polling, they're driving these negative messages on our candidate, and it's so terrible. And I always say, well, how many calls were made? Because if there were a few hundred calls, that's survey research. If there were thousands of calls, yeah, maybe that's push polling. But if you just talk about that, do you hear that backlash too when you in your business?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think we've become better consumers in understanding what push polls are versus regular polls. Obviously, pollsters don't like the term push poll because it's not technically a poll. You're absolutely right. I mean, the desire of a push poll is just to give out information without actually collecting information. Polls are designed more to collect the information rather than to distribute the information. So whenever you get a push poll, quote unquote, you typically, they aren't asking you many questions about who you are or your beliefs. They're simply designed to give you information. If you knew that Bill Smith believed blah, 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 this, how would that's the survey in their minds. Right. And candidates, I will tell you, candidates, as you know well, are sometimes reluctant to test messaging, either on themselves or on their opponents, because they don't want to be seen as doing a push poll. But we keep telling them, we're talking to 300 voters or 400 voters, or in the case of the statewide, 500 to 600. This is clearly not the most cost-effective way to give out that information. You can do it much cheaper somewhere else. And we're less concerned about, convincing a voter convincing a voter of that piece of information, more just understanding how they react to learning about that information.
Yeah, I've had to explain that to many candidates over the years, and the public too. It's like, no, it's just survey research. Relax, it's okay. We could talk for hours on this. We got to be judicious with our audience here, but so that's the political side of your business. You also have a non-political side to your business, because campaigns kind of pop up in a flurry every even year, maybe, unless you've got some of these states like Virginia and others that are doing stuff in the odd year. But your bread and butter sometimes is what do you do for business clients, without naming any clients? But what does it look like? What does a business need a pollster for, and what kind of survey research do you do for them?
Yeah, and it runs, and so politics is maybe about a third to 40% of our business. The majority of our business is non-political in nature, and it's all over the map. From we work for a financial technology company that is trying to understand marketing strategies, who their target audience should be, how they reach that target audience, what aspects of their offering appeal to those target audiences. So in many respects, well, it's a lot like running a campaign, right? You're better understanding kind of what motivates and what drives those particular consumers to act, much like you would do with voters and getting them how to turn out to vote. What aspects of your product or your offering or your services appeal to those consumers, and then how you convince them to actually go out and purchase your product based on that. So, and the same with the targeting too, is helping them understand these are your core demographic groups that are likely to purchase your product. So those are the folks you should really be focusing on. We do that for companies that are trying to sell products or services. For business clients, trade associations or member organizations where they're trying to understand their membership, how they care about certain issues, how impactful those issues are on their business, what they want that membership organization to do for them, all those things that we test in surveys and provide that feedback for clients. On the issue advocacy side, that's really similar again to what we do in politics. One is we kind of measure the public or the electorate in terms of how they feel about the way things are going, what issues are most important to them. We measure the intensity of the issues, I think, which is extremely important. It's one thing to just kind of say, hey, here's how voters feel about abortion or taxes or the economy or immigration. It's another thing to measure the intensity behind those issues and how passionately they feel about that. We do that for public affairs clients, and also if they have positions that they want to advance in the public policy debate or pass legislation on, we test that. We better understand how you can talk about that to a public that's not familiar with it. and what groups you should focus on that are more likely to be sympathetic to your cause. So in many respects, it's very, very similar to what we do for campaigns. Yeah.
But just, ongoing, and we campaigns come and go. You win or lose. I mean, obviously you have some congressional clients that win and then keep winning, so you have ongoing. But a lot of I used to say it's a lot like business. You do start a business when you run a campaign. You raise seed capital. You develop a message or a product. You sell and market that product. The difference is it's a one-day sale. It's like, well, except in Minnesota it's a 46-day sale. Let's be honest. But the election day is a one-day deal. You win or lose. At least in the business world, you can have a great day in sales and then next month have it again. But that's a good analogy, though. Well, let's dive into the anatomy of a poll a little bit with the time we have. It starts with a questionnaire. Obviously, asking the right questions and asking the questions the right way is key. And like I know in our relationship, we have a brainstorming session. We just had one yesterday, as a matter of fact, for our next poll, and we have every topic thrown around, and then a lot of times we will write up kind of what we're trying to get at. But I rely on you guys to sort of write the questions. And there's some science involved in that, right? I mean, if you I say, oh, you can ask a poll, you can get any answer you want if you ask the question the right way. There's kind of some truth to that. We really work hard at asking I don't want to say unbiased, but a question that really just doesn't tell what we're thinking in our question. And talk about the science behind that, or at least your experience in that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important for the credibility of the poll to be as unbiased as possible. So that's one of the things that we work really hard at with you guys, to make sure that we're asking questions that aren't leading respondents in one way or the other. That's oftentimes a little bit hard because to get to some of the issues that we test, for instance, voters may not be familiar with what's going on. For instance, when you ask things about what's happening in the legislature, or decisions being made about spending money here and there, you have to sometimes provide a little bit of context so the voters understand that. But what we typically do, and sort of how we develop these polls, is, as you noted, we have a brainstorming session. We sit down, we put all these ideas on paper, and we draft questions that kind of get at that. And I think working with you guys to understand some of the nuances of the issues in Minnesota, since we're not on the ground there, is particularly helpful. Once we've done that, and once we kind of settle on, here's going to be our focus on this particular issue set, we then carefully make sure that the questions, and go through a process of making sure the questions aren't leading in one way or the other or biased. Questionnaire order is obviously really important too. You have to be careful that you're not putting questions ahead of it, which could lead respondents in a certain direction that might impact the results too. So we're careful to make sure that's done correctly. And then what we typically do is, once we get the survey done, we'll spend the first hour of interviewing just testing it out to make sure people understand it. And so for the first hour or so at the end of the survey, we ask kind of an open-ended question. Did these questions make sense? Did you have any concerns about this? And 9 times out of 10, if not more, we're fine and respondents understand what we're doing. There are occasions, and it's never happened with our work here, because I think in large part we're really diligent in terms of making sure these questions are easy to understand. But in some really complicated surveys that we do, or around complicated topics, we a lot of times will have to hit pause, go back to the drawing board a little bit, and tweak some of these questions to make sure the respondents understand what we have to say. But that's kind of how we got it wrong.
We've got it wrong before. I can't remember the topic, but we asked a question a year ago or so where we kind of had a preconceived, well, conservatives will think this way and liberals will think this way. And it came in the opposite. And we stared at that answer for the longest time, like, why did this result happen from this question? It really, and then we realized when you read the wording, okay, I get this now. People just did not understand the question. We threw the question out. I mean, we will do that. I mean, we don't publish every single answer we get from our polling, but that one, we threw that one out, and we've done, I think it was provisional balloting. Actually, now that I think of it, we tried to explain what provisional balloting is, because we don't have it in Minnesota, so Minnesotans aren't familiar with it. We tried to explain it, and we thought that conservatives would, oh yeah, we want that, and liberals would say, no, we don't want that, and it was the opposite. And we realized that the way we asked it, it raised red flags for conservatives unnecessarily. So we've fixed that question in recent polling. The poll is out right now. Actually, our current poll has a question on provisional balloting, and the answers are more what we would expect. So you got to have an expectation of what would come back. But oftentimes, I'll tell you also, we are completely surprised by answers, which is the fun of this. I mean, it's like you go in with a preconceived notion. If you ask the question the right way, you get an answer you might not even like. We might not even like it. The fact that Minnesotans believe this way because we think it should be in a different way. Well, we have work to do then. But that's kind of the fun of the questionnaire. All right, so we've got the questionnaire. You go out. What are the mechanics? You don't put a headset on and call 500 people or in Minnesota and ask them the survey. You probably don't have employees that do that either. Are you using a call center? I mean, what is the mechanics of who makes these calls? I mean, who calls me on the phone to do the survey?
Right. We have a call center. We do not do the actual interviewing. We do listen in on it. We have the ability to listen in on interviewers as they're conducting interviews. But that quality assurance piece of that you oftentimes hear whenever you get a call. But we have a call center that's based in Salt Lake City that we use for all of our live dialing surveys. So we have a team, I think right now, because it is an election year, because they do staff up a lot for those sort of surveys. I think it's about 150 live interviewers who dial the numbers, who conduct the interviews. And so they do the data collection piece of that. As you know, in the polling industry, you go back to 2010, even 2012, certainly on the Republican side of the ledger, most polls were still predominantly conducted among or using landline telephones. So we would dial a landline phone, we would get someone, we would conduct the interview. Today, we've moved heavily towards using mobile phones and dialing cell phones to get people to connect to do the survey. So most of our samples are somewhere in the 70-80% range of cell phone to landline completes. So they do that. We're typically in the field for about 3 to 4 days, depending on the length of the survey. Once we get that raw data back, we look at the sample.
Well, before you get there, you're targeting. You have some targets in mind, right? You're trying to get balance. Like if we have a 500 person survey, which is our normal survey in Minnesota, you call more than 500 people because you're trying to get a balance of gender, geography. I've asked you this before. I always thought you did political balance, but you're not actually getting political balance. It's coming naturally from the survey. Remarkably very similar every poll too. But you're calling you have some targets in mind, right, in terms of making sure we got the right cross section?
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you for that point. What we do before we even do the dialing is after we pull the sample file, if it's a survey among registered voters, for instance, we'll pull the actual voter file to use that as the basis of our sample. We will set quotas based on region. So every county in Minneapolis or in Minnesota gets a certain number of completes based on their share of the overall population of the electorate. So we'll set quotas on region. We'll set quotas on gender to make sure we have a gender balanced sample. We'll also set quotas on age. Typically, if you do not do that, you tend to get a much older sample. Older Americans or voters are more likely to conduct a survey than younger voters. That has just always been the case. So there are certain things on the back end that we can adjust because of that, but we don't really want to tinker as much on the back end of the survey as possible. So we'll set quotas up front to make sure that we're getting the number of respondents in terms of their age breaks based on what we know of the electorate or the population as a whole. And then one of the things that we've also been carefully monitoring is an education level. And another kind of facet about polling, that if you don't set educational quotas, you're going to get a much more educated sample. Non-college voters or adults are much less likely to conduct a survey or to participate in a survey. So we want to make sure that they're equally represented in that sample too. So we set those quotas at the front end, and the call centers are kind of like checking to make sure as they go along that they're filling those buckets. We do a little more than 500, but not a lot. If we're meeting those quotas, Bill, then we're typically able to kind of stop at 500. once we've reached those quotas. And that's more of our objective, is making sure we get the right people in there at the beginning. Now, after we've done that, after we go through the data, we look at the representation of it, there are times where we have to adjust some of those quotas. And we do that through weighting the data.
Okay, I was going to ask about that. So there's some weighting.
There is some, yeah. The weighting is one of those things, less is best, right? So and usually when you set quotas up front, the weighting you do is minimal, if at all. And in some of the cases, we've done surveys for you guys where we have not had to weight it at all. We've met the regional quotas. We've met the gender quotas, the age quotas, the education numbers came in that we know based on census data or voter stats, whatever kind of metric we're using, were the right metrics. And so sometimes we haven't had to weight that at all. In other cases, we have. Minnesota is one of those states that's voters do not register by party, whereas they do in other states. I think it's 36 states that register by party, but don't quote me on that. But Minnesota does not. And so as such, we sort of treat party affiliation or identification as sort of a floating barometer. And you'll see through our surveys, it does fluctuate a little bit, not a lot, because when you've met all these other, when you've met these other quotas along the ways, it's largely been pretty consistent. We've been fortunate in that respect.
Yeah, I think I asked you a year ago or so. I assumed you were waiting for that, or not waiting for it. Like you say, targeting, or I can't remember the word you just used, but quota. You said a quota on that, and then you said, no, I've not been quoted. That's not a quota. That just happens. Like, that's remarkable, that because I got to tell you, it comes in conservative, liberal, nothing, or Democrat, Republican, very similar poll after poll, year after year in Minnesota. So what do you look for if you looked at a poll like a Rasmussen poll that just came out in Minnesota, recently, or any poll, and you say, all right, what do you look for? What do you jump to say, all right, well, okay, this is the result? How is it weighting? Is it quotas? Is it how many they called? I mean, as a consumer of polls, what should people look for to know if that's a good poll or something you could trust?
It's hard for the average person to kind of understand whether or not a poll is accurate or not. So I will say, because one of the first things we tend to look at is I go right to the demographic section. And one of the most frustrating things about certain publicly released polls is they don't release demographic information about their sample, which is maddening. And it's even more frustrating when the media picks it up and runs with it. It is, to me, it's akin to making sure your sources are well vetted, and they're not. A lot of times the media is not, vetting these polls. But we'll go to the demographic section, and it's the basic stuff that we would normally use to judge the representative nature of our sample, which is, are the gender splits right? Is the sample and demographically, gender quotas, does the gender look right? Does party look right? Even in a state like Minnesota, you kind of know roughly what the percentage of self-identified or affiliated Republicans are going to be versus Democrats. If it is massively more Republican sample than Democrat sample, or the other way around, you immediately throw it away. So you're looking for it, I think, on party, on gender, on age. Race is not as big of a factor in Minnesota, but it is a tremendously big factor in a state like North Carolina or Georgia or Texas. So you would look at those factors, and then you kind of look, the last piece of how the survey was conducted. The gold standard still in campaign and political polling is live interviewer phone surveys. And some of my colleagues are going to argue with that. They have every right to do, though. But that, in my estimation, is still the gold standard. A lot of public polls, though, are now using online sample as a way to interview folks and to do it cost effectively. The primary benefit of an online sample is it's cheap, because you're not using a live person to have to call the number. And one thing I should have mentioned, too, on the dialing piece of this, because so much of our polling has moved to cell phone mobile dialing and interviewing, FCC law requires that the interviewer must manually enter in that number and dial it, as opposed to using an auto dialer.
Oh, really?
That takes a long time to do that. Yeah, and so that's one of the real challenges of polling, is you have to manually dial that number.
So they make the pollsters do that, but we don't have to do that like for get out the vote. Get out the vote efforts or political calling, those are all predictive dialers. You're sitting at a machine, you're just waiting for that next call to come up. But the pollsters still have to do that. That's kind of weird. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, and I'm not so sure about the legal ramifications of others who can use auto dialers on cell phones. That's probably more for a lawyer than for me to handle. But that is one of the challenges of and why it takes a little bit longer and it's more costly to do the poll the right way. But I'm going to get back to the online sample for a moment, because a lot of these public polls rely on online samples to kind of supplement or in some cases completely replace live interviews. And there's no accurate way to append email addresses to a voter file. A lot of companies are doing it and have had some success for doing it, but at a wide scale where you can completely replace telephone interviewing with online, we're not there yet on the voter file level. So what they do to offset that is go out and purchase online records from various online samples. And that's not a completely random sample. And so a lot of times these public polls will do an online piece of a sample, will do an online methodology and report it as a probabilistic, completely random sample, and it's not. And so if I see that in a political poll, it's one of the big red flags I usually flag as well.
Yeah. Well, a couple more questions and we're going to wrap up. But just you touched on it a little bit. Just trusting the science here. I mean, we've got a poll skeptic on our staff, and we always laugh about her. But she just doesn't. Oh, she says people lie. It's not representative. How can they do it? And I think the real difference is these candidate head-to-heads versus the issue stuff. And just at American Experiment, we don't do candidate head-to-heads. I mean, we'll check in on favorability or job performance of a local elected officials like the governor, and that's interesting. But we're not in the business of political polling. So, and you said it earlier, most of your work is not really head-to-head, because just talk about that head-to-head poll, really the moment in time, right? The biggest flaw in that is that might be accurate for about 10 minutes on the day that you got the survey done, and then is that really the case today or on election day? The difference there.
Yeah. I mean, we always, I love to tell candidates that the first time you get a poll is to take Elvis's advice, which is don't get caught in the trap. Don't immediately go to the ballot, which is the trap that most candidates get called in. When we analyze polling data, for the bulk of what we do for campaigns, the ballot is usually one of the last things that we kind of focus on. And in fact, when you look at a political poll, I've been saying this ad nauseum for the last month for every campaign I've worked with, is that the ballot is the lagging indicator. It's usually the last thing that moves in a political survey. So once campaigns are engaged, once they're talking to voters, the first thing that really moves in a political survey is what we call campaign information flow. And that is, are voters hearing, seeing, reading anything about your candidate, your campaign? How is that information making you feel about the candidate? More favorable, less favorable, or no difference? That's usually the first place that we start to see movement in a campaign. The second place is the image numbers. How do you feel about that candidate? Do you have generally a favorable, unfavorable opinion? Is it very favorable, somewhat favorable, to get an intensity? So then the second thing that moves is image, and then the ballot is always the lagging indicator. And so when we're studying data later in the course of a campaign, where we're trying to figure out if our message is penetrating, if we're moving the needle, we're looking more at campaign information flow and image numbers than we are with the ballot. And so in terms of how we analyze the data, the ballot is usually one of the least important things in the course of a campaign. Now, obviously, as you get to election day and what the polls are doing now, they're purely focused on the ballot. But yeah, there's not really been a case where campaign information flow has moved and image flow numbers have moved and the ballot never moved. That's just never happened. So we're more focused on those two factors, honestly, as we kind of dissect the data than we are with the ballot. So I always tell candidates, I know it's important to you, but realize that's going to change. And chances are, when we're in the field on a poll, if we were to go back in a week later, if we saw movement in those other two metrics, then we would see movement in the ballot.
Yeah, and you're on a campaign team using polling to influence the strategy of the campaign, and so it's a tool for strategy and implementation, and so the result happens on election day. Unfortunately, election days become election week or election 6 weeks in Minnesota, but still mostly even in Minnesota, I think it's like 60 or 70% of the electorate votes in the last week. Even though they're voting early, the early voting is really jammed to the last week plus election day. So, but really, it's not about head to head on October 1st. It's about, is the strategy right? Are we moving voters? Are the messages we're doing actually moving independents into our camp one at a time? Then stay on it. Stay on that message. Keep the money behind that message. It's working. And by the time we get to election day, we'll peak and we'll win.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, things in terms of campaigns primarily use two types of surveys. The benchmark, which I described earlier, where we really are kind of laying out who our target audiences are and what our messages are to that target audience. So the ballot is there, but it's not as important as those other aspects. And the late campaign, which is the brush fire surveys, they're smaller, they're shorter, they're more succinct. We use those to fine tune that campaign messaging and strategy and the advertising, making sure it's listening. We also use open ends as another way of kind of understanding, are voters hearing our message? Are they believing our message? And vice versa with our opponent. Is their messaging penetrating at a much better rate than ours or not so? And we're using that polling to fine tune that message, or in some cases completely change the message or our target audience, and making sure that our voter outreach, whether it's digital, mail, TV, radio, or a mix of all those, making sure that's actually having the impact it's supposed to.
All right. Having said all of this whole half hour on ballot test, it is election day today. You have access to polling for congressional candidates mainly in many, many states, including swing states. So for those of you that listen to this podcast today on election day, or that listen to it tomorrow after the results are, you can test whether we're accurate or not. How are you feeling? You work mostly or maybe exclusively for Republican candidates, conservative candidates. So what are you seeing nationally? What is your feeling? I don't want to make a prediction, but you've got privy to a lot of information and data in a lot of states. How are you feeling as we sit here on election day 2024?
Like a cat on a hot tin roof. It is. I've been doing this for 26 years, north of 25 years. A long time. I started after college, even in college, working on campaigns. I'm a campaign junkie, even if it's not the majority of what we do. I have never seen an election this close, certainly in the polling. And we're polling in about 25 congressional districts, kind of swing congressional districts, from state of Washington, Oregon, to New York, to Maine, to Texas, to Minnesota, to Iowa, every place in between. And we've just not seen it this close. And we're not involved in the presidential level. So we get asked all the time, who's going to win? I don't know. And I kind of go back to that line where I started, which is survey research is a tool, not a predictor. Though the media really wants to use it as a predictor.
I know.
But so I think big picture, I think this election is going to come down really to kind of two questions. One, who's the change agent? I mean, one of the things that we track on national polls, I think is particularly important, is this right direction, wrong track. And everybody says, oh, it's kind of past its time. It's not pretty. It's always wrong track. Numbers are high. And yeah, they are. I think right now about 2/3 of voters nationally believe the country's off on the wrong track. The numbers are almost identical to what they were in 2016 when Trump won against Hillary Clinton in a change election. Numbers that aren't that dissimilar to what we saw in 2020 when Biden beat Trump in a change election. There's really good science that when wrong track numbers are in the 60s, we're going through a change cycle. That's where we are now. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing the Harris campaign really try to position her as a change agent, but
turn the page.
Right. They're really trying to tap into that. But I see this as a change election in that respect. I think the data shows that pretty clearly. And then the second is the dominant issue, and I don't care where you are nationally, is the economy and pocketbook issues, is cost of living, and which candidate's going to be stronger on those in that issue set. And so those are the things I'm kind of looking for when we kind of start breaking this down. But I mean, I'm amazed at just how close the election ends in those swing battleground states, particularly Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. When you see these numbers and the differences in the polls of, I would argue anything within 3 points, one way or the other, is within the margin of error. And so therefore, by statistical definition, it's a toss-up. But the media is reporting that Trump is up by 0.5 or that Harris is up by 1.2. That doesn't mean they're up. That means that race is tied. And very well, Trump could be up by a larger margin than that, or Harris could be up by a larger margin than that, based on how the margin of error works. So all this to say, all these states are tight, which I think when we get down to it, the thing that's going to be really, really fascinating, I think, as we kind of look at the numbers tomorrow and the days after the election, is who turned out. One of the things I tell people that if you could tell me with accuracy who turns out, I could give you a perfect poll.
Right.
Because as pollsters and campaigns, we have to make assumptions. When we set those quotas at the beginning of a survey, we have to base them on something. And it's a shared understanding of what we expect the electorate to look like. And as we've known, particularly in the last two presidential elections, but even going back to 2008 with Obama and 2012 in the reelect, campaigns can influence and impact who turns out.
Right.
They can do that. And as a pollster, it makes our job particularly challenging because we have to have a set of shared understandings and beliefs for which to base that sample and those quotas on in the very beginning. And so if we have, and we're starting to see this with early voting numbers in states like North Carolina right now, where the share of the electorate looks a lot different than it has in the past. Republicans are making up a larger share of early vote than they have ever done historically. African-American voters are not voting at the levels they have in the past election. So that may all change by the time we get to election day. And those numbers may level out or they may not. And the electorate could look distinctly different in 2024 than what we saw in 2020 or even 2016. So to me, that's kind of one of the real interesting aspects. And given how much money is being poured into those three target states and the Midwest and Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, they very well could be a much different electorate than we've seen before.
All right. Well, that's a lot of information. I was fascinating. I mean, I learned some things here in this little half hour we spent or more. I think the message is, if you're listening to this on election day at 3:00 in the afternoon, the polls are open in Minnesota for another 5 hours. You should go vote. It's going to matter. I mean, that's kind of the hope in this, is that if you think your vote doesn't matter, even in a state like Minnesota, it absolutely will. It'll count in the down ballot races, your school board races, your state legislative races, and even the U.S. Senate race and the presidential we have in Minnesota. So we can end on that positive, joyful note of go vote if you haven't voted yet. If you're on your way home from work, listening to this in the car, stop at the poll, stay in line, and vote. Well, thanks a lot, Rob. Great. I'm really glad we were able to do this. I like I said, I learned something, and I think it's a really good deep dive into polling, and I hope people have more of an understanding of it and maybe less skepticism about the results or what to look for when they look at a poll and how to read it. So thanks a lot. This has been the American Experiment Podcast.